Okay, welcome to another episode of the Doomer Optimism podcast. My name is Donald, and I'm joined by two guests who have been here before, Medical Nemesis and David Cayley, neither of whom I think need an introduction at this point. But we're going to be talking about Ivan Illich today. And on the bus ride this morning, I was looking through this book, which is a book-length conversation that David had with Yvonne, the first of two book-length conversations. And David, I wanted to start with a question for you. That initially, Ivan Illich, you interviewed him and the tapes came back blank. And you intimate in the book that he kind of hexed them or something. And he was very reticent to do that interview, but it was after meeting you and after meeting your children that he agreed to have this conversation with you. It was kind of the start of a friendship. So the conversation, there's a brief conversation between the two of you about the modern idea of childhood and about how your kids didn't do that exactly. And I'm really curious that you kept your kids out of school. Nowadays, it's not that strange of a thing, but when you did it, I think it was a little harder to do. And so I'm just curious about that, about how if you could talk a little bit about keeping your kids out of school and how that encounter, how Ivan Illich's encounter with you and your children started your friendship.
Well, I'm glad you didn't ask me whether you could really hex tape recorders or not, because I don't really know the answer to that. It could have been that I did something wrong and there was something wrong with the machine, but it definitely was a blank tape. I got back to the studio and I had thought it was recording and the VU meter indicated that it was. So we were influenced by the deschooling society and probably also pretty aware of John Holt and the network he started called Growing Without Schooling. We had moved back to Toronto after living in Vancouver and then living in the rural Ontario for a couple of years. So although we had lived in Toronto earlier, we weren't well connected. So we suggested to our eldest child, Eunice, and my eldest child, Kate, that she go to school and see what was going on there. And she returned after a couple of weeks and said, I'm paraphrasing, she didn't use these words, that she found it extremely cliquish and that she was always interrupted whenever she began to do something. So we said, well, okay, then don't go anymore. And the adventure really started from there. We were probably lucky in that child, Kate, because she was a model of self-education. She was slow to read, and we had also been influenced by Steiner's thought and various others who had suggested to us that a lot of reading problems are a failure to respect individuality and that people will take on reading at different ages, which is very hard to determine what would be the right age from the outside and probably impossible to develop a program for it. So she was a late reader, but once she began, I would say by age 14, I was asking her questions because I wanted to know the answer, not because it was a Socratic stratagem. So the political situation in Ontario at that time was right on the cusp. They had been taking people to court over the issue, and they stopped within the year of our excusing Kate from school. They stopped, and we from then on had a relatively copacetic relationship with two super teachers from the Board of Education who would visit us from time to time, and we would exchange educational philosophies, so to speak. Kate never went to school. Her brothers both immediately, they both wanted to go to high school. Complicated. They both were very emphatic they were not like her. Right? So there's obviously some sibling relationship involved. But I think they just wanted to be in the scene. And I had been very impressed as a young man by whether they were people who had grown up in intentional religious communities or grown up in a communist household. The difficulty of getting out of a total ideology had impressed itself very strongly on me. So we had always said that they were excused from school. They were not. They were free to attend school at any time they wanted. And both boys went to high school, where they were mediocre but satisfied students. So that's the story in brief. I think whatever Ivan perceived on that summer day in 1987, when he changed his mind about opening himself to conversation with me, I think it wasn't just the homeschooling. I think it was the vibe, as you might say. It was seemingly a recognition of something that was going to change both our lives. A moment of intuition, or whatever you call it.
Well, he had good intuition, because both the recorded conversations came out. I don't know. I think it would be hard to find. It's hard to find a way through his work. It's hard to imagine finding a way through his work without them now. I think.
Well, yeah, that was the gift of it, because I never had any trouble finding my way through his work. I had responded to it uh, very quickly. So, but yes, the recorded, the spoken Illich meant a lot to people who couldn't quite get the written Illich, and that was something he recognized after that book that you showed was published. No, he was quite. I don't think he ever read it, but he was quite taken with the number of people who showed up and said, "I see what you're saying now." Right? So, yeah.
And I feel like when I read Illich, I'm moved by it and learn a lot from it, but I feel like I'm always on the cusp of really understanding what he's talking about, and I never quite
Okay.
get there all the way.
Interesting.
And I don't know, Medical Nemesis, feel free to jump in with questions too, or I don't have to preside over this as an interviewer. Feel free, you two can ask each other questions too. But I think part of it has to be with his approach. It's so historical. He's really a historian. And his casts his mind back, I don't know, to the 12th century, earlier, to the church fathers, in a way that I have trouble doing.
Well, I think that, I mean, that has you probably only get one teacher like that. At least I only did, and one was enough. And that, I think, is a lifelong learning for me, uh, to understand how deeply he was an historian, uh, and to understand that the past unlocks the future, um, which I think is something one can forget and remember and forget and remember endlessly, uh, especially in a world which lives entirely in the present, in kind of expanded material present, and which has renounced the past, uh, is embarrassed by it, doesn't want to know about it, and consequently is completely disoriented in relation to the future. Yeah, that's a deep meaning of his work for me, is that orientation in time. And of course, it's central, absolutely central to his work, uh, and to his vocation, to try and reopen, let's say, the incarnation to people, to to understand that this has been overlaid and overlaid and overlaid, and that there's no alternative to to going back, to rethinking. Uh, you wouldn't even have the knowledge of it if it hadn't been preserved in the church. There's no way around the paradox. Uh, there's no spirituality, as people now say, which can just, that it'll all magically come to you. It actually is a historical reality. And that's an essence of Christianity for me as well. An essence of it. The word is always problematic because it stands for the paradox. But yeah, so yes, he was deeply an historian, and probably always, right? In the sense that his whole message to the church was, that a new church, on which he insisted for nearly 20 years, until he withdrew, was that a new church would be utterly traditional, and a traditional church would be utterly new, that those two were inseparable, that they could only be thought together, that one without the other, would be either stagnation or disorienting or disoriented change. They must interpenetrate. So, yeah.
The conversation I've always dreamed of listening to is between Illich and Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, who's gave a series of radio addresses which were published as Faith and Future, which are remarkably Illichian, in which he kind of prophetically has this vision of a much smaller church. And anyway, it's like Illich's work or any interesting book, it's hard to paraphrase. But Illich, I think, criticizes Ratzinger in writing.
Well, yeah, he really gets the sharp side of his tongue in the final section of that book that you showed, which is on the question of life.
Exactly.
Right?
But about
ecclesiology and scientism, right?
Right. On ecclesiology, anyway, I think they would have had a lot to say to each other. But it's fascinating that someone, Ratzinger gave those radio addresses before he was a cardinal, even, I think. But it's kind of remarkable that someone who thought that way was became pope and then became the not historically unprecedented, but the historically rare Pope Emeritus, which I think I would have been curious what Illich would have made of all that too.
Yes, I would too. But I mean, he respected the Ratzinger.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of his close associates, Wolfgang Sachs, was a student of Ratzinger's way back. And so I think he differed with him sharply on that one point.
He respected him enough to write and talk about him.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So, but I mean, he was outside almost all church conversations after 1968, which is so strange. And it continues even now.
Yeah, he's almost never talked about or read as a Catholic writer.
No, I mean, there are exceptions. Colin Miller did a beautiful essay on him as a Catholic theologian. But
and your biography of him was reviewed in First Things and other. He's remembered occasionally. Yeah, he gets remembered occasionally. And I think your book really brings out how much of a Catholic, how that shaped his thinking entirely, and how much of his writing, even when he's writing on the surface about school or about medicine, I mean, he's really writing about the church at the same time.
Well, I don't accept that. Not as you said it. This was a point of issue between me and Todd Hart, who wrote a book called The Prophet of Cuernavaca, in which he, in a certain way, discounted the critiques of school and medicine and so on as merely veiled ecclesiology, as if it had all been sort of a roman à clef. But I don't think that's what Illich said. I think he said that these were descendants, right? That these were stamped, these institutions were stamped from the church's mold. He makes a persuasive case that that's true, but they operate independently in the world with their own characteristics, and the analysis of those characteristics is aimed at those characteristics. It's not just a way of of getting at the church.
So Medical Nemesis,
the medical system is the subject of Medical Nemesis, not the Roman Catholic Church.
So that's a perfect. We have another guest here. So Medical Nemesis, if you, I'm curious if you have a question for David or vice versa.
Oh, I would like to first expand on why people don't understand Illich, because people read books that Illich wrote on various subjects, and they were directed at secular audiences, and nobody actually ever asks what kind of a man Ivan Illich was and what was the meaning of life for him. In fact, these questions, what is man and what is the meaning of life, which David Cayley so eloquently elaborates on in his book, Ivan Illich, An Intellectual Journey. You cannot move past these questions in trying to understand the work and the direction of life of a particular man, unlike any other. And when 2020 rolled in and I found David Cayley and we talked on the phone, he directed me towards the book, The Rivers North of the Future, which is a very complex book. And the first thing that you get from this book, that Ivan Illich was a man of God, first and foremost, and that shaped his whole worldview, that kept it bound in a tradition, which he kept saying that he was born in a certain tradition and he wasn't going to give it up, no matter what bad things came with it. That was his cross to carry, so to speak. But what is interesting that when the time of trial came to him, when this growth appeared on his jaw, he didn't go to any Catholic doctors or any secular, scientific doctors. He actually sought out a Muslim man in Pakistan. So this is where this meaning of what it means to be man of a certain kind and share a certain tradition and certain worldview of understanding what you are, how the world works, and how everything within this world comes under what we know as God, which science would come under this understanding, and the secular science that um, emerges as scientism precisely because there is no bound system. It's sort of like a ship in the middle of the sea that keeps spinning around and going here and there, forever lost. Ivan Illich, as a man of faith, was not lost. He knew of his final destination, and this shaped the whole course of his work that remains indecipherable to people who fail to pay interest to him, first and foremost, as a man, mortal man, like all of us, not an academic, not a historian, but somebody who was born in a certain tradition. And all of his work was directed by it. And he maybe didn't speak of God in his work for the reasons that he explained in his books, that God doesn't seem to exist in this world anymore. But his work becomes legible if you actually try to understand him as a man first, and then he will become more legible as an academic that exists, solidly in the realm of secular science.
Well, I agree and disagree with what you've said. But I think this goes back to what I said a moment ago to Donald, which is I do think the books that he wrote are intelligible to non-believers. And it may be that then opens the question, well, what is a believer? What is a non-believer? I think then of Simone Weil and some of her writings on atheism as a purification and implicit forms of the love of God. I think if we look on the surface of whether this one is a Christian and this one is not a Christian, we often are misled about the dispositions of that person. So that becomes complicated. I think when he set out after 1968, after the troubles with Rome, and he decided it would be fruitless to continue within the church, he set out to try and see if he could talk to people without presuming faith. He says that specifically in Medical Nemesis, that faith cannot be relied on, cannot be compelled, cannot be required, and therefore he wanted to speak in a way that people could understand whether or not faith was present in them. So, to take a very simple example, in the analysis of schooling, to say that school is a system for producing dropouts is a sociological statement. It doesn't require faith. You can give empirical evidence of it. He was reacting to what he saw in Puerto Rico and elsewhere in Latin America in making that statement. That this was it leads to the presumption that this is a displaced church, because it otherwise appears a completely irrational scheme for imparting education. But I do always want to insist on the potential intelligibility of all those analyses, whether of transportation, whether of schooling, whether of medicine, and later larger reflections in media ecology as in in the vineyard of the text, and so on. So, but I also agree with you that it helps to see who he was in order to understand him. Yes, and there may certainly be things that are incomprehensible without that knowledge.
Well, I actually am a unique example why his book Medical Nemesis became the purpose of my life. I grew up in the Soviet Union, and all of my formative years, I grew up in an atheist state. So God was not there. We did not have Bibles. So I was not raised in understanding anything faith related. Yet when I read the book Ivan Illich, and the way I came to it through a tradition. So I came to it through a certain worldview that underneath it did have the concealed notions of what it means to live and what it means to die and what it means to be sick. So I came from an atheist background, and his book appealed to me, essentially as somebody who was atheist, during my upbringing. However, Illich does say you cannot make anybody believe. You either believe or you don't believe. And a lot of the people who are raised in the school that proclaims faith into science, which it is a faith, because science and scientists accept a certain worldview and certain tenets that they do follow that kind of keeps their scientific enterprise bound. They essentially embody what Ivan Illich explained later, 10 years after he wrote Medical Nemesis, that each historical moment is incarnated in an epoch-specific body. The reason his work is not intelligible to a lot of the people, because people today who are raised in the West to understand themselves through biology and through physiology and through genes and zygotes and mitochondria, they actually do not understand what it felt like to be a man like Illich, because simply of the way and the time where he was raised. The reason it's intelligible to me, I think, I cannot say scientifically we align. You would have to trace the history of tradition where he came from, his specific family, because parts of his family came from the part of Ukraine, roughly where I'm from. But scientifically, it would be incorrect to say that we share that heritage. We do not. We came of different kinds of people, yet there are some intersections of how we understand the world around us. So I agree with you, David, that it can be intelligible to people who come from non-faith backgrounds, but his work specifically on medicine and suffering is more intelligible to people who live outside of the Western realm, who have some connection to some other cultures that have not been permeated and imploded from the inside, by understanding that man is not a guinea pig, man is not an immune system, man is not a collection of genes, it is something else. And each culture and each kinds of people have this understanding of what we are as people. And Ivan Illich writes quite a lot about it. And it doesn't mean that it is wrong to be different kind of people. The fact is that we are different kind of people, and I think this is what a lot of people miss, and this is the tragedy of medicine rolling, crushing lives of individual men and women that are not like one another. We are not the same. We are quite different. We are unique, and yet there is something that we share in common. So there are these contradictions. And I think your work, David, adequately preserves this proportionality and a lot of contradictions that seem to be mutually incompatible, but yet they are compatible, because our world is not neatly ordered like people think. Science.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, the ideas that people today hold about science, that we have these rules and laws, that they actually, that idea that there is the world one world that's ordered by one law. It comes from Judeo-Christian tradition, and other traditions also mirror that in a sense. But if we trace the history of scientific thought, everybody thinks that the world is run by these rules and laws that we've discovered. And when there is some odd example that doesn't fit it, it just means we haven't discovered these laws. We just need to try harder, which is quite ridiculous to anybody who understands the history and philosophy of science and philosophy on science and the history of scientific thought.
Yes. Well, I mean, I would like to believe that this is a moment, a revelatory moment in that respect. An apocalyptic moment, if you take that in the meaning of revelation, right? That the abuse of science during the pandemic was so patent, so out in the open, as to show the truth of what you just said. And yet it remains, by and large, invisible. I think hardly a day goes by that I don't meet someone, often someone dear to me, who knows from a few cues not to listen to me on this subject. That I'm one of those. Uh-oh, here he goes. So it's amazing how well people have been insulated or fortified or prevented from understanding the meaning of the meaning that seems patent to me and what has just taken place. So, yes.
Wittgenstein has a line in the Tractatus: the basis of the whole modern view of the world. At the basis of the whole modern view of the world lies the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of natural phenomena. Anyway, it came to mind.
Yes, that's a deep saying, because presumably he's talking about the difference between why things happened and observed regularities in their happening.
Yes.
Is that how you understand him?
Yes.
Yeah. The observed regularities don't explain the happenings or guarantee that things will always happen that way.
It's comforting to have magical explanations of causality, though, sometimes.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because David is a journalist, but a lot of his work, the body of his work throughout his life was in fact exploring the history of ideas by interviewing a lot of different, I don't want to call them scientists. Scientists became somewhat of a dirty word because these are people who deal with numbers. I would like to pay tribute to the people whom David interviewed, and I would like to say that David belongs to this class of people who are scholars, who don't dwell in numbers and data, but attempt to understand the complex nuance that's inherent to each moment, each phenomenon, each situation. That, it's very easy to, calculate something in numbers and find some statistical proof that this happened because of this. But, in each individual case, if we study it, if we study a lot of context-bound things that happened, it's actually next to impossible to say why it happened. There is no explanation, and it's very humbling, and it's very scary, and it's very unsettling. This is why we reach out for the certainty of numbers, because we know that if the numbers forecast that nothing will happen to me, that means nothing will happen to me, which is very untrue, because there are now tons of people for whom risk factors didn't exist, yet they're dead, and then there are people for whom risk factors existed and these people are alive, and there is no explanation in each individual case why this happened to you. And all kinds of people who believe in God explain it simply by the grace of God. There is this chance and there is this unknown that we exist in that makes us uncomfortable. And some people make peace with it and live a certain life as guided by what is good and by abstaining from evil. And then there are people who are guided by the transitory truths of numbers, and they keep running around like a stampede of mammoths or dinosaurs destined for extinction.
Yes, quite.
So I'm always fascinated when figures I'm interested in overlap or almost overlap, and how they tie together. So Illich was connected in some way to thinkers like Marshall McLuhan. He was interested in writing and the relationship to speech, and he wrote books about it. And I'm really fascinated with the poets and thinkers who were indirectly or directly students of Ezra Pound, McLuhan, one of them, Hugh Kenner, these other. And I'm curious if there's any connection between Pound and Illich. Did they ever, that, or if more generally, if Illich, read poetry or thought about poetry.
He did read and loved poetry. Certainly Auden. I think often in German. A huge love for Rilke as an adolescent, and very deeply versed in the work of Paul Celan later. Yes, there was a great love of poetry, but I never chanced to cross any knowledge of Pound, he and McLuhan did meet. There was a dinner party in Toronto in the 70s, but I think it was only once. And it was always very difficult to tell what Ivan had read and how much of it he had read, right? So
you get the impression in his books that he read everything.
Yes, you could get that impression.
The range of citations is kind of terrifying, actually.
Yeah, well, in some books, like Medical Nemesis is extremely
or Gender.
Or Gender, yes. Gender was written that was all done in a white heat, as far as I can tell. So how all those references were assimilated is anybody's guess. But often he would speak where and not give you any orientation at all. So the question of life would be an example of that. So he relates that he gave that talk in 1989 to a Lutheran convocation in Chicago, in which he said that life was the greatest idol that the church had to face in her history. An astonishing statement in a group of life worshippers. And I was so fascinated by what he had said that I made a broadcast with him on ideas that went to all of Canada. And it seemed as if went absolutely unnoticed. I'd never had an experience like that in 40 years as a broadcaster. It was as if no one had said anything. And I think it was so incomprehensible in a certain way. But there, he didn't provide any genealogy at all. I mean, you would have thought he would have had to engage with romantic philosophy, with Schelling, with Nietzsche, with Bergson, right? I mean, the word life didn't just start being used in the 1980s as the great sign and seal, as it was in the pandemic, that we were saving lives. You don't need to say any more. That's all. That's what we're all about: saving lives. But so, there I have no idea if he ever opened a page of Schelling, or I think he'd read a little bit of Nietzsche. So yeah, so he was deeply versed in the subjects he took on, but many mysteries.
What was obvious during these last 3 years, and Twitter for me made it very, very apparent about the lack of maliciousness on the part of many people, the impoverished knowledge people have as the result of this so-called science education. Everybody literally, even in the same team reality, argued in numbers, of lives saved. The traditional philosophical or theological understanding of a variety of different situations that arise between two physical bodies present in the absence of each other, and the rich legal tradition in many religions deal with this inherent ambiguity of what is right and wrong to do here and now. Modern medicine and modern politics, they don't necessarily run on a tradition built in the logic and reasoning and building of arguments. They are built on data that arises from the kind of analysis of a formal language through computer programming and calculation. So they are two vastly different traditions, and people think that these abstract numbers that come up in computers, they are gospel and almost word of God, except instead of God we have word of science now, and it is truth. But there is complete lack of understanding how this knowledge arises, and this is why a lot of experts today will be replaced by computers, because they have no clue what they are doing, and they de-skilled themselves, and they became so ignorant they actually don't understand what they're doing, because the only thing that they can do is apply algorithms and formulas based on input of numbers. They cannot differentiate between somebody who is drowning and statistical numbers of the elderly people in hospice on the last breath. And historically, you would never do anything to a dying person lest you cause their death. We were actually avoiding doing anything that would cause the death of another person in certain tradition.
Yeah.
So this, in science, we call it qualitative difference of me causing something versus something happening just because it happened. Completely absent. And precisely these issues come up and bubble up to the surface in the questions of vaccination, which date back all the way to smallpox vaccination. The reason why people historically, learned people, objected to vaccination, because in certain cases, when we gave medicine to healthy people, they died. And it is prohibitive that we kill anybody, and applying medicine to somebody who is not sick, it's just logically illogical. Today, when this salvation by numbers in bulk happens, it's actually very justified, and it makes sense within the political act of vaccination, of managing population. It has no relation whatsoever to the wellness of individual people, because we agreed that we will sacrifice I don't know, one person, 100, 1,000, because we are saving a whole lot more. Historically, this argument was unacceptable to anybody who actually believed that you are sacred because you are a creation of God, and I cannot harm you in an attempt to save anybody. Well, today we actually disregard you. It's okay that if I give you a vaccine when you're healthy and you die because I saved 100, therefore I am morally justified to do it. Historically, in all of history, it it wasn't a logical argument. We knew that separation between what is good to do here and now and the way communities kept well and bore their suffering, preventing this crossover of taking control of what we do not control, which is who lives and who dies. Modern political state convinced everybody that, you know, man is made at a hospital and he is immediately baptized with vaccines because otherwise he would die. Like, you cannot live. And then eventually you reach a point when I pronounce that there's nothing else I can do to prolong your life. You actually, even if you have ability to live for 5 more years, you actually give up because, you know, I give up on you. You know, I am the giver of life. Say that, you know, we've reached the limits. I have no more drugs to give you. I cannot nuke you with radiation anymore. And the person loses all hope to live. And now we here in Canada, we started killing people to prevent suffering, which again, it is so wrong because traditionally there was understanding that I cannot torture you. But at the same time, if you are suffering because of some illness, it does not mean that you should kill yourself. There are people around who would carry you along and drag you along and make your life meaningful and make you feel not like a burden, that you will live a life full of meaning. And you know, our mutual salvation came from your gift to me, um, to assist you in your suffering. And you suffered just because you could not suffer because, you know, something happened to you, some accident or illness. It did not mean we had to actually kill you to eliminate suffering. And this is where we are, this loss of nuance of different kinds of situations where today I can torture you to save a life, and cause extreme suffering upon you. And at the same time, if I deem your suffering unworthy, and we call it, I hate that, quality of life, you know, then it's okay to kill you. And we call it good death to top that. It is incomprehensible to anybody who comes from what I call normal and sane background of understanding of what it means to live.
Well, that's an alarming statement you've just made because it seems as if the great majority of people in my milieu, and I think if you believe polls in the country, believe that the assisted death regime that we have and are probably going to extend once we have the right protocols in place is broadly acceptable. And yet I can't imagine a better way. You know, people asked during the pandemic, well, why did one person go this way and why did the other go that way? Who were the ones who objected? Who were the ones who went along? Well, I would think facing a regime like the one Canada is in the process of building out, because we're not finished with it yet, right? We still have the question in front of our legislators, whether this will be extended to the mentally ill. And it's widely accepted as a right, which is a very strange discourse, that one has a right to be executed by a physician. So yeah, I find it just remarkable. The other thing that's very striking in what you just said is the use of the term sacrifice in relation to adverse outcomes of vaccination. I think it's a very, very telling word as a return, as representing, under the guise of science, a return to sacrifice. The very thing which Christianity had seemingly overcome. And I think it fits in with a larger analysis of science as the return of myth generally. That is, it seemed to me throughout the pandemic that science operated in all sorts of public and political discourses, and in many scientific discourses as pure myth. It had virtually nothing to do with the actual operations of working science. And indeed, all sorts of scientists were ignored, barred, canceled. The emblematic event in Ontario for me, where I live in Canada, was an interview given by our former chief medical officer of health, so a charter member of the public health establishment, interviewed by the CBC on March 20, 2020, who raised some very intelligent questions about lockdown, a procedure that previously unknown, not at all part of the discourse of public health, even conventional public health, and quite unacceptable in the terms of that discourse. He raised some questions about it. He was immediately canceled by the CBC. He subsequently obtained the emails and sent them to the CBC ombudsman without anything occurring. And that's just emblematic of the cancellation of various other scientists during the pandemic. So it seems as if, yes, it's operating, science is operating as pure myth, as you see in Anthony Fauci's famous statement that he is science. Yes, indeed, he is. So, so thank you for that, introducing that word sacrifice.
David, I'm curious about something with the recent Canadian enthusiasm for physician killing.
Yeah.
That in some states in the United States, this was decriminalized some time ago, but there was not it hasn't been adopted at the rate or with the public enthusiasm as has happened in Canada. And I'm curious why you think, if you have any thoughts on why that is.
Well,
like why it seems like Canada, so there's not unique in this, the Netherlands or some other countries where, you know, like a startling number of the deaths in the country are now occur in this manner. And I think Canada has become one of these places too. But I'm curious why some countries have decriminalized it and it hasn't sort of taken hold, and in other places it really has.
Well, I find it easier to explain the American case than the Canadian, but you may know that one of the origins of Canada is in counter-revolutionary Toryism. That is, what you call your revolution was a 7-year civil war, which more or less split the country in half. And a lot of the losers became founding citizens of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and the lower and upper Canada, today Ontario and Quebec. So I think that the American taste for freedom and the American resistance to the state, for good and ill, is much stronger than in Canada. Now, why we have been so easily drawn into this kind of social democratic niceness about everything, right, is that, you know, to be swaddled in care, be suffocated by care from the moment we're born to the moment we die seems to be a possibly predominant ambition. And it's hard to, I think it's hard to explain. But I think probably the most promising angle is the worship of life. Is what Illich sketched, and which maybe you can guide me. I still don't think this has been properly explained. He takes it as a new stage of religiosity, he says in Illich in Conversation, because he doesn't want to say, I think, a new religion, because that would obscure the affiliation with the incarnation, right? That we would not be worshiping life if there had not been the one who said, I am life. That couldn't, it was always his claim that we could only have gotten to where we are through the Christian door, as it were. That's the whole meaning of the corruption of the best is the worst, right? So he didn't want to say a new religion, but it functions. So whether it's a stage of religiosity or a new religion, it functions as a religion. It functions as a sacred. And it was Medical Nemesis who pointed out to me when we were talking a couple of years ago that medicine, in a way, is the maximum sacred, the most unquestionable element of that religion, the hierarchical peak of that priesthood is medicine. So I guess maybe the question is why the Americans in such numbers won't swallow it. God bless you. Because, Canadians want to be administered extreme unction by the highest, most acceptable priest, who is the kindly doctor who brings the fatal cocktail to your home. That's not much of an explanation.
Well, I think Barbara Duden, in her work, built upon the work of Illich, traces these ideas of why we save lives is to the birth of the idea of labor as an economic resource that's scarce, and people writing works on the wealth of nations, and that the resources, people as resources, bring wealth to the nation. So the state acquires this imperative or desire to enhance and preserve its economic resource that is the wealth of the nation. And then Michel Foucault talks about this transition to biopower and biopolitics of a sovereign, which is the state now, is to make live and let die. So when your time comes to die, if you are still of some value, economic value to the state, the state is not going to let you die. And once they've extracted everything from you as an economic value, they will let you die. This is where we're at. While historically, the sovereign made you die and let you live. So this switch happened at some point in time in early 18th century. And, this was the beginning of, this was actually the time of the birth of modern science and, the beginning of the rise in populations. And we began surviving long before modern medicine. In fact, we started surviving in larger numbers in 18th century without any achievements of modern medicine. So I think a lot of this medicine, it ties into the politics of the state, not necessarily the well-being of people, how people perceive it. And this is why people are so unhappy, because this mass production of health as a service and as a product for consumption is a detachment from traditional understanding of what it means to be healthy, whole, and holy that is preserved in religions of this world, that you actually have to do something every day that is good and right, and this is how you are kept whole. And health comes as a result of your holiness in action, in relation and proportionality to the world of God around you, which is in complete divorce today, when all you have to do is just show up, get your vitamins and shots, and be this number upon which these manipulations are performed on, and your health is granted to you. And we're getting sick. We can see it. We can look around and see that everybody is sick. Everybody is scared. In 2020, everybody went psychotic. I mean, this was the worst psychosis than I've ever seen. But so we're not
God
healthy.
bless you.
Yeah, we're not healthy by any measure. But most people are convinced that we are doing spectacularly well, sitting in the middle of complete destruction. A person can be completely destroyed as man, and their health is not good, but the numbers tell them that they are really, really well. And this disconnect between what you see and what you feel in this body and this mortal flesh, that is, we're not perfect. All of us, we cannot engineer and mastermind our own health and whatnot, not no matter what we try. And it manifests itself as, I've done everything right. Why did this happen to me? Because it can happen to you. There are no guarantees in this life. It seems obvious to anybody who is sane, but the people who are educated out of their wits to be this scientifically minded dimwit, they think that numbers guarantee something for them in this life, which is not how the world works. And it's very hard to convince people who are clinging to numbers for dear life. They swear by them that this is not how reality works. And there come times of trial when your numbers are not going to help you. It's going to be somebody who is mortal and imperfect, who will give you a boost, who will give you a shoulder to lean on, no matter how tough the going gets. And at some point, that means you will be in pain, you will suffer and die. And you are very lucky if you are struck by the hand of God and die of a heart attack quickly. And it doesn't matter what caused this heart attack, because you will die how you lived. This is sort of, and it doesn't matter how long you lived, because in all of history, men were preoccupied with, am I living a good life? And at the end of life, your day of judgment will come on your deathbed, or wherever you are met. You could be met on a battlefield, or at work, or in a car on the road, or in a shopping mall. This is going to be your moment of judgment. People say life blinks in front of them and whatnot, and you will not care about numbers, and you will not care about how long you live. You will probably think of people or places or something that gave you life meaning. And we are creatures that seek meaning. The whole last 3 years makes it very apparent, if you look at it, as how different people interpret what happened through various frameworks, worldviews, applying different methods. We try to explain what happens to us.
Yes.
I'm curious for both of you, in the last couple of years, but really the last century, to what extent to call a lot of these problems as stemming from bureaucracy, that as the culture has become more bureaucratic and more school-like, that this is not just in the domain of education or in science, but in everything. And something that really strikes me is that, and I think Illich says this very well, that school teaches you to operate in a kind of bureaucratic way. That the way to do things, you have to get past certain gatekeepers. Like you move up, you go from first grade to second grade. The teachers operate as gatekeepers, and you move through these certain levels. And then after you leave school, then that's how you think you need to approach work and life. You get through certain gatekeepers, you move on to the next level. this school has a very bureaucratic approach, and is a terrible way to think about life. But unfortunately, it's becoming more and more real. That things are, at least on the surface, organized that way. And I don't know how to put the order of this, that like that schooling produces bureaucracy, or the other way around. Maybe causality doesn't matter. But does that make sense? Is bureaucracy too much of an abstraction?
Well, I think that the helpful element in Illich is to take you back, and many others have walked this path. Some were walking it alongside him, and I don't think he knew it. So many discoveries I made after his death. I mean, one notable one was Harold Berman, a legal scholar, in a book called Law and Revolution, which, but the scholars of radical orthodoxy were walking in parallel also, but and many others since. But Illich draws attention to the singularity of the Roman Church after the late 11th century, and you could tell the story differently and go back further, right? Which creates this law-governed proto-state in Rome, which becomes the model for all states, and presumably their inspiration, which is important. That the promise of salvation, that there is an institution that will perform for you or in your place, to which you can belong, and by belonging to it, you will be saved. Indeed, there's no salvation outside of it, specifically said at that time. So that's this is not to say that a church, in some sense, is implicit in the gospel, but not that particular church, right? So what Illich calls the criminalization of sin, for example, which is the legalization of the idea of sin, completely denatures the idea of sin. It turns it from a liberating perspective, a way in which I can see my error in the light of its forgiveness, into an enslaving perspective, right? A way I can be kept always on the hook, always, always at the service of the church and the priest. And so I think that's in a way what comes first, right? And this is just a thought, but if you take seriously Illich's saying, or his adaptation of an old saw, the corruption of the best is the worst, right? It's important that this was the best. Right? It wasn't just any religion. It wasn't just any good. It was the best, the highest possible knowledge. This is what God is in human form. And so that lends the power and the persuasiveness to the institution, right? And it continues to impart it to the successor institutions. So I think that comes before. The bureaucracy is the enactment of that salvation. So that's just a guess. That's just my sense of it. I don't know if that answers the question you're trying to ask. So what's thrilling in that, what's helpful in that is if you see it, you can potentially begin to unwind it, right? You have a grounds on which to begin to trust your own judgment, right? To withdraw your allegiance, to stop believing that you ought to be swaddled in care, that it's irresponsible not to be swaddled in care, that there's anything that you can find out moment to moment in free encounter, in a free existence. That's a very thrilling thing to begin to understand. And I mean, you know, the fact that the whole pandemic discourse in Canada was operated by the idea of mutual care, right? That the unmasked pervert was endangering the neighbor, right? That anyone who cared for their neighbor would go along, and these others can be identified as careless people who don't, self-indulgent, stupid, careless people who don't care for their neighbors. I wear the mask for you. I don't wear it for myself. This whole sacramental side, I think, was huge. I mean, I'm talking about my friends, my neighborhood, the world I had to live in. I'm not talking about something I've learned from a podcast.
I'm fascinated by the persistence of masking, which still continues. And it's interesting because it's now contrary, at least from what I understand, to the advice even of like the public health authorities and so on. And I'm curious, I don't know, I've never talked to someone. I'd be kind of interested to actually of what the rationale or the, you know, it's anyway, I am not totally sure. I try to imagine, but I don't totally understand now what the rationale is.
It's very painful in Toronto to pass people in midsummer in the open air in a mask. I mean, it makes you, I mean, it just terrify people like that, right? Well, you could blame the people that they were sheep and that they were willing to be terrified, but surely the terrorizer is more responsible, right? And to have done so in the face of the science. I mean, I lived my whole life in the face of this movement for evidence-based medicine. It dominated medical discourse in my milieu, right? And its guiding star was always the randomized trial. Always. We can't just, you know, do the doctor does what the doctor does in childbirth. No, we have to test it. Is this a rational procedure? No, it isn't, right? Then we reject it. So to have, at the beginning of the pandemic, and have it admitted by the Chief Medical Officer of Health in Canada, the WHO as well, that masking was demonstrably ineffective against respiratory viruses, to have no randomized trial had ever shown a benefit, to have the mask then on second grade observational studies, right, that may or may not have had any probative value, to introduce this ritual and then have it shown again at the end in this big Cochrane Library study, meta study, that there's still no grade 1 scientific evidence in favor of it. I mean, it's amazing that you could, because I know so many people who just wouldn't believe me. They would just think I was a crank. Just somebody claiming studies, like all conspiracy theorists cite studies, so it shouldn't be any surprise that I cite studies, right? They know that good people wear masks and bad people don't wear a mask. And the bad people are called anti-maskers. I had somebody say that to me the other day. Oh yeah, you were an anti-masker. I mean, it's exasperating. And yet the person addressing me knows, is, as I said before, is fully defended against my view. Because as soon as I begin to speak it, they can identify me as belonging to an enemy category. Conspiracy theorist, an anti-masker, an anti-vaxxer, right? It's an amazing bit of mass psychological manipulation. And I think Medical Nemesis has given us evidence that she's at least braver than me. I don't know if she's braver than you in being able to look the world in the eye. But this definitely has its 1984 side.
But when Ivan Illich revisited his work in Medical Nemesis, and he was very pleased with what he wrote, but he was regretful he didn't analyze the situation kind of deep enough, that the ill-making effect of medicine was remaking how we conceptualize ourselves and how we perceive ourselves. So the iatrogenic effect of medicine, when you come in contact with medicine, when you go and visit the doctor, or when you're subjected to some kind of education about the human body, you actually start conceiving yourself not as man that comes of a certain tradition from certain people who is this way because we are this way. You start perceiving yourself as a collection of cells and body systems, and that you are a complex system. And a lot of the people during pandemic who were hit the hardest, they were the most educated, they were the best of the best, they were elites, they were the most corrupted, they were the most educated to perceive themselves as parts of a collective immune system that must be amended or protected from this outside invader. They do not have the worldview that we make one with all the bacteria and viruses and fungi all around us. They perceive themselves as distinct selves, which is also Ivan Illich wrote about this idea of a distinct self that that exists outside of everybody else and the world around. It's an idea that appeared in medieval ages, and then when Ivan Illich was researching something as a historian, he was amazed to find out that there were no bodies like his in the 12th century. And Barbara Duden writes about it, that in the 18th century, there was this new idea, new creation of ours called the bourgeois body that was ordered. You had to order yourself because we've discovered that environment acts upon us, and we were supposed to order ourselves and our environment a certain way and control it in a certain way to make our own health. And even the very idea that you own a body, historically people didn't have bodies. Like the having part, the possession part was not there. And Barbara Duden also writes about this. So the people who wear masks, to whom it makes sense, and this is why to David and me it does not make sense. David and I are different kinds of people. We do not have the perception of ourselves as an immune system in need of any protection, and we have a somewhat sane understanding that a mask does work in certain contexts. If I am to go into a patient ward where there is somebody coughing and they have the flu, I would wear goggles and I would wear all the protective gear for a particular reason, so that I do not transmit it to actually other patients and I do not get infected. And so I would wear a certain type of mask, which historically was just a surgical mask, which in my opinion, it wasn't enough. And um, a stronger protection would warrant itself in clinical settings, and you would go into that room for the shortest amount of time, wear it for that amount of time, and get out. You cannot control an outbreak of this type of an infection, which is not airborne HIV. It is not smallpox. It is not a skin infection. This type of a respiratory affliction, once there is an outbreak, you cannot control it, even in a control environment on a hospital unit. To think that you can control it in a society at large is just plain insane. We traditionally did not hold anybody accountable for infecting us, with the cold. We didn't even think of this. You couldn't trace whom you got it from. You cannot trace from whom you got an HIV infection. Like, there are patients who come with HIV. We often cannot trace where it came from, which potentially is a much more limited exposure. Well, here, just the insanity of it, but the people who perceive themselves as these distinct biological immune systems, and they know that a mask works in some contexts, but they are completely incapable of synthesis. They got some broken part of some scientific research and some study somewhere, extrapolated it to the world at large, which is completely inapplicable because they know word inference, which doesn't apply here. We don't think this way scientifically, but they feel justified in wearing a mask because this is what they believe, based on some snippets of some scientific studies that don't work together as a whole. If we look at the totality of everything, you don't even need randomized control studies. Not technically, realistically, if you would observe a hospital unit, no hospital worker is able to maintain perfect seal. Um, you know, um, Nobody is able to not touch the mask all the time, adjusted. One of the worst masks I've seen during this whole pandemic was a surgeon. He tortured that mask while we talked, like for 20 minutes. He was ripping it apart, touching it, moving it. If there was something that was not infection prevention, and surgeons are often cited as surgeons wear masks. Surgeons are normal people. No normal person would be able to maintain perfect 24-hour masking if you were meant to filter the environment around you. And it's a purely philosophical deliberation. You would be born with filters in your nose. You would be born with goggles in your eyes. We are not born this way. And it's incomprehensible to somebody who was created by a doctor in a hospital that the way you are is the way you're supposed to be. People, honest to God, believe that you are born a cripple that must be improved upon. Body parts must be cut off, amended, you must be ejected by something to make you into a body that's actually capable of living. Theologically, it is an incomprehensible idea because we think that you were made in the image of God, but the people who were not made in the image of God, they know that infants are born with immature, defective immune systems. Therefore, they must be amended to make them better. Philosophically, it's just a bizarre idea. But people, take it to extremes. We now see people remake themselves in the image of their own ideas. Plastic surgery. Where did it come from? It comes from these, seemingly benign ideas of, okay, let's amend the immune system. It seems logical, but theologians back in the day were vehemently against it on theological grounds because it would implode your whole worldview. But then we think, okay, I don't like my nose, I don't like my hair color, I don't like my ears. Now we're like, well, I think I was born a man, let me go chop everything off, or sew something back on. there is no end to this insanity. It comes from the sickness in the head. Historically, people would view people who would think that they need to be improved upon as just sick in the head, and nobody would even talk to you. People would feel merciful and, compassionate towards you just because you're feeble in the mind. Today, we call it progressive. We think this is wonderful that you think that you're born a cripple and that we can improve upon you. It's just, we live in a topsy-turvy world, which is hilarious. You start to begin to understand the meaning of laughing fools in history. The reason they were laughing was not because they were crazy, they just had a great sense of humor. And once they reached a certain point in life, when they were old enough, they just thought, well, I might as well just laugh at that because it's so crazy. Uh, you just laugh alone, observing this whole world. And we're not the first people who experience this. If we read historical accounts, like, we're just going through iterations of one and the same thing, we're just digging deeper and deeper. And it's becoming worse and worse. And now we think we will become transhuman. If you fly through airports, they have special gates for bionicles. Bionicles proceed to gate number 24. And it's like, God knows what these bionicles are. But, there are some of us who don't want to be bionicles. We don't want to be transhuman. We don't want to be improved. We have hearts that fail. We fail as humans. We do stupid things. We accept them, that I've done, this is wrong, and the chance I get, I will do something right. There is at least this hope for redemption that, I've done everything wrong in my life, but because I have a very clear idea of what right and wrong is, the first moment that I see an opening to do right, I would grab onto it. Right now, we don't even have that. We're so lost, we don't know what right and wrong is anymore. Because data is not quite there yet. We just must wait for data.
Well,
I can't improve on that.
I think, yeah, we'll end there. Thank you so much, the two of you, for joining me today. And hopefully, someday the three of us can sit together in person and chat about these things. So I'm gonna stop the recording.
Yeah, okay, good.